The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sterling Tech Industries, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany conference table. In the corner of the boardroom, Margaret Chin sat quietly with her laptop open, fingers moving silently across the keyboard as she transcribed every word being spoken. To the 12 investors gathered around the table, she was invisible furniture, just another piece of office equipment that happened to breathe. Richard Sterling stood at the head of the table, his tailored suit impeccable, his silver hair perfectly styled, commanding the room with the confidence of a man who had built a technology empire. He gestured toward the wall-mounted display showing complex algorithms and patent diagrams, his voice carrying the weight of authority as he addressed the potential investors. This story takes place in the heart of Silicon Valley, where fortunes are made and lost on the strength of innovation and the ruthlessness of ambition. I wonder, where are you watching this story unfold from today? Drop a comment and let me know your location, because no matter where you are in the world, you've probably encountered someone like Richard Sterling, someone who takes credit for work that isn't entirely their own. Margaret had been taking notes in boardrooms like this for 15 years, ever since she had graduated with her master's degree in electrical engineering from Stanford. She remembered the day she had first walked into this building, her portfolio tucked under her arm, expecting to interview for an engineering position. Instead, Richard had looked at her resume, glanced at her briefly, and offered her a secretarial position with benefits. She had needed the job, needed the stability, and had told herself it would be temporary. 15 years later, temporary had become permanent, and her engineering dreams had been buried under layers of meeting minutes, appointment scheduling, and the careful maintenance of Richard's professional image. But what no one in that boardroom knew, what Richard himself had forgotten after all these years, was that Margaret had never stopped being an engineer. She had simply learned to engineer solutions quietly, invisibly, in the margins of other people's recognition. Richard clicked to the next slide, showing a breakthrough algorithm that had revolutionized data compression. The patents for this technology alone were worth $47 million, and licensing deals with major tech companies brought in steady revenue that had funded Sterling Tech's expansion into 12 countries. Sterling Tech had grown from a small startup to a multinational corporation, Richard explained to the investors, because of his innovative approach to solving complex technological problems. He spoke about late nights spent perfecting code, about breakthrough moments that had come to him in flashes of inspiration, about the dedication and genius required to transform abstract mathematical concepts into practical applications that changed entire industries. Margaret continued typing, her expression neutral, though her fingers hesitated for just a moment when Richard described his eureka moment for the compression algorithm. She remembered that night differently. She remembered staying until 3 in the morning, working through equations on the whiteboard in Richard's office while he slept on the couch. She remembered the moment when the solution had finally clicked, when she had seen how to optimize the recursive function in a way that would reduce processing time by 63%. She had written the solution on the whiteboard, had documented every step of the mathematical proof, had even prepared a detailed explanation for Richard to review in the morning. When he had awakened, he had studied her work for 20 minutes, asked 3 clarifying questions, then told her to clean the whiteboard and prepare a presentation for the next day. The patent application had been filed 2 weeks later, with Richard Sterling listed as the sole inventor. One of the investors, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s representing a venture capital firm, raised her hand with a question about the technical specifications. She had noticed Margaret's subtle nod when Richard had mentioned processing efficiency metrics, and something about the secretary's reaction suggested deeper knowledge than her position would typically require. Richard gestured dismissively toward Margaret's corner. "That's just my secretary," he said with a slight laugh. "She's been with the company for years, picks up bits and pieces of the technical language. Margaret handles all the filing and paperwork, keeps everything organized. Don't worry about her understanding the complexities of what we do here." The investor nodded, but her gaze lingered on Margaret for another moment before returning to Richard's presentation. Margaret kept typing, her face expressionless, though something flickered behind her dark eyes. She had learned long ago that survival in this environment required invisibility, required letting others take credit, required swallowing her pride in exchange for stability and steady income. But lately, that stability had been threatened. Richard's wife Elena had filed for divorce 6 months ago, and her legal team was demanding 50% of all marital assets, including the intellectual property portfolio that formed the foundation of Sterling Tech's value. The divorce proceedings had turned vicious, with both sides fighting over patents worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Richard's attorney had assured him that the patents were safe, that his wife had no claim to intellectual property created during his work hours using company resources. But Elena's lawyers were thorough, and they had been asking detailed questions about the development process, about who had access to Richard's work, about the timeline of various innovations. During his deposition the previous week, Richard had been confident, even arrogant. He had described himself as the sole creative force behind Sterling Tech's success, the visionary whose genius had transformed abstract concepts into profitable reality. When Elena's attorney had asked about support staff and their potential contributions, Richard had scoffed. He employed secretaries and administrative assistants, he had explained, not collaborators. His work was too complex, too specialized for anyone without advanced degrees and years of experience to understand, let alone contribute to. The meeting concluded with handshakes and promises of follow-up communications. The investors filed out of the boardroom, chatting among themselves about market potential and projected returns. Richard gathered his presentation materials, already mentally preparing for his next appointment. Margaret closed her laptop and began collecting the empty coffee cups and water glasses left behind by the meeting participants. It was a task that fell to her automatically, part of the invisible maintenance work that kept the machinery of business running smoothly. As she stacked the dishes on a tray, she overheard Richard speaking to his personal attorney on the phone. The divorce should be finalized within 2 months, Richard was saying. Elena's team is grasping at straws, trying to claim she deserves credit for work she never understood. The patents are ironclad, all filed under my name, all developed through my research and innovation. She'll walk away with half the liquid assets and spousal support, but the intellectual property stays with the company where it belongs. Margaret paused in her cleaning, her hand hovering over a forgotten notepad. Richard's voice carried the absolute certainty of a man who had never doubted his own version of events, who had told the story of his success so many times that he had begun to believe it completely. But Margaret remembered those years differently. She remembered the problems that had seemed impossible until she had found the solutions. She remembered the patents that existed because of work she had done in the quiet hours when the building was empty and her engineering mind was free to explore without interruption. As she carried the tray toward the door, Margaret caught her reflection in the polished surface of the conference table. For just a moment, she saw not the invisible secretary who had spent 15 years in the shadows, but the brilliant engineer who had been systematically erased from the story of Sterling Tech's success. Tomorrow, she would return to her desk, would continue taking notes and scheduling appointments and maintaining the illusion that Richard Sterling was the sole architect of the company's innovations. But tonight, Margaret thought as she walked through the empty corridor toward the kitchen, tonight she would go home to her modest apartment and open the file cabinets where she had spent 15 years carefully documenting every algorithm, every breakthrough, every moment of genuine innovation that had built the Sterling Tech empire. Tonight, she would remember who she really was beneath the carefully constructed facade of professional invisibility. The courthouse steps were slick with morning rain as Margaret climbed toward the imposing glass and steel building that housed the Superior Court of Santa Clara County. Her worn leather portfolio clutched tightly against her chest. She moved through the crowd of attorneys and litigants with the same invisible efficiency that had defined her professional life. Today marked the 3rd week of testimony in Sterling versus Sterling, and Margaret's presence in the gallery had become as routine and unnoticed as her attendance at corporate board meetings. Inside courtroom 4B, the atmosphere was charged with the tension that accompanies high-stakes divorce proceedings. Elena Sterling sat at the plaintiff's table with her team of 3 attorneys, their expensive suits and confident demeanor suggesting they were prepared for battle. Across the aisle, Richard occupied the defendant's position, flanked by his own legal arsenal, men who had built their careers protecting the assets of Silicon Valley's elite. Margaret took her usual seat in the 3rd row, notebook open, pen ready. Richard's attorney had requested her presence to serve as a witness to company operations, though her testimony was expected to be brief and purely administrative. She was there to confirm filing dates, meeting schedules, and other clerical details that might support Richard's claims about his work habits and creative process. Judge Patricia Hendricks called the session to order, her silver hair pulled back severely, her expression suggesting decades of experience with wealthy men fighting over the spoils of failed marriages. Richard was called to the witness stand for his second day of testimony, his confident stride and expensive suit projecting the image of a successful technology pioneer defending his life's work. Under questioning from his own attorney, Richard painted a picture of tireless innovation and creative genius. He described 18-hour workdays spent in his private laboratory, breakthrough moments that had come to him during late-night coding sessions, and the painstaking process of transforming theoretical concepts into practical applications. His patent portfolio, he testified, represented 15 years of dedicated research and development, innovations that had emerged from his unique understanding of computational theory and mathematical optimization. The Sterling Tech patent collection included 47 separate inventions, Richard explained to the court. These ranged from fundamental algorithms that improved data processing efficiency to specialized hardware designs that had been licensed to major technology companies worldwide. The licensing revenue alone generated approximately $12 million annually, while the underlying technology had enabled Sterling Tech's expansion into markets across 3 continents. Margaret listened to Richard's testimony with the same neutral expression she maintained during board meetings, her pen moving steadily across the page as she documented his claims. But beneath her professional facade, she felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. Richard was describing innovations she remembered developing, problems she had solved, breakthroughs that had occurred during her solitary work sessions when the building was empty and she could think without interruption. When Elena's attorney rose for cross-examination, the questions became more pointed. He wanted to know about Richard's formal education in specific technical areas, about his published research prior to founding Sterling Tech, about the timeline of various innovations, and whether they had emerged fully formed or through collaborative development processes. Richard's answers remained confident, though Margaret noticed subtle signs of irritation when pressed for technical details. He had founded Sterling Tech immediately after completing his MBA, he testified, building upon theoretical knowledge he had acquired during his undergraduate engineering studies 20 years earlier. His innovations had emerged through individual research and experimentation, aided only by standard administrative support for documentation and filing. The attorney pressed further, asking about the role of other personnel in the development process. Richard's response was dismissive and revealing. He employed administrative staff to handle paperwork and scheduling, he explained, but the actual creative and technical work was entirely his own. His secretary, Margaret Chun, had been with the company for 15 years in a purely clerical capacity, handling filing, basic correspondence, and meeting coordination. Margaret's pen paused for a moment as she heard herself characterized once again as mere administrative support. She glanced around the courtroom, noting the expensive artwork, the polished wood paneling, the atmosphere of serious legal proceedings where fortunes were decided and lives were changed. Then she thought about her own modest apartment in Mountain View, the 2-bedroom unit she shared with her elderly mother, the careful budgeting required to make ends meet on her secretary's salary despite working for a company valued at over $300 million. Richard had purchased a 7-bedroom mansion in Los Altos Hills 3 years earlier, Margaret knew, because she had coordinated the real estate transactions and managed the interior design appointments. The house sat on 4 acres with panoramic views of Silicon Valley, complete with a tennis court, swimming pool, and wine cellar that Richard had stocked with bottles costing more than Margaret's monthly rent. His garage housed a collection of luxury vehicles, while Margaret still drove the 10-year-old Honda Civic she had purchased used when her previous car finally died. The contrast between their lifestyles had always been stark, but sitting in that courtroom, listening to Richard describe 15 years of solo innovation, Margaret felt the full weight of the injustice. The patents that funded his mansions and luxury cars had emerged from problems she had solved, equations she had balanced, algorithms she had optimized during countless late nights, when inspiration finally struck and solutions emerged from complexity. During a brief recess, Margaret stepped into the hallway to stretch her legs and collect her thoughts. She was approached by Sarah Martinez, the court reporter who had been documenting the proceedings with silent efficiency. Sarah had noticed Margaret's subtle reactions during technical testimony, the way she occasionally shook her head almost imperceptibly when Richard made claims about development timelines or mathematical principles. Sarah mentioned that she had worked many technology cases over the years and had developed an ear for technical accuracy versus impressive-sounding claims that didn't quite add up. She had noticed Margaret's apparent familiarity with complex concepts and wondered about her background. Margaret explained briefly about her engineering education and her role at Sterling Tech, describing herself simply as long-term administrative support. But Sarah's trained eye had caught something more significant. She had noticed Margaret's subtle corrections to her own transcription when Richard made technical statements, small amendments that suggested deeper knowledge than a typical administrative employee would possess. When Margaret confirmed she had an engineering degree, Sarah's expression grew thoughtful, as if puzzle pieces were beginning to align in her mind. The afternoon session brought a surprise that sent ripples through both legal teams. Professor David Kim from Stanford University had been called as an expert witness to testify about the technical complexity and innovative nature of Sterling Tech's patent portfolio. Margaret recognized him immediately as her former graduate advisor, the man who had guided her thesis research on optimization algorithms 15 years earlier. Professor Kim's presence in the courtroom was Elena's legal team's attempt to establish the sophisticated nature of the innovations in question, to demonstrate that the patents represented genuinely complex technical achievements that would require advanced expertise to develop. But as Margaret watched her former mentor take the stand, she felt a different kind of anticipation building. Richard's attorney objected to much of Professor Kim's testimony, arguing that expert analysis of patent complexity was irrelevant to the question of marital property division. But Judge Hendricks allowed the testimony to proceed, noting that understanding the nature and value of the intellectual property was central to making an informed decision about asset division. Professor Kim began by explaining the mathematical foundations underlying several of Sterling Tech's most valuable patents. He described the theoretical challenges involved in optimizing recursive algorithms, the innovative approaches required to achieve significant improvements in processing efficiency, and the sophisticated understanding of computational theory that would be necessary to develop such solutions. As Professor Kim spoke, Margaret found herself remembering late-night conversations in his office 15 years earlier, discussions about theoretical problems that had seemed impossibly complex at the time. She remembered the excitement of discovering elegant solutions to mathematical challenges, the satisfaction of proving that optimization approaches she had developed could achieve results that existing methods couldn't match. Margaret continued taking notes as the testimony proceeded, but her mind was racing beyond the confines of the courtroom. She was thinking about the file cabinets in her apartment, the careful documentation she had maintained for 15 years. She had copies of everything: initial problem statements, mathematical proofs, algorithm designs, test results, even email chains documenting the development process for every major innovation. Richard had always insisted that employees sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements, but Margaret had been careful to retain copies of her own work product. She had told herself it was simple professional caution, maintaining records of her contributions for potential future reference. But as she sat in that courtroom, listening to Professor Kim describe the genuine innovation and mathematical sophistication required for the work she had actually performed, Margaret began to understand that her documentation represented something more powerful than mere professional records. The session ended with Professor Kim scheduled to continue his testimony the following day, and Elena's legal team huddling in intense discussion about technical details and development timelines. Margaret gathered her notes and prepared to leave, but she noticed that Sarah Martinez was watching her with an expression of growing interest and speculation. As Margaret walked back through the rain toward her old Honda in the courthouse parking garage, she found herself thinking not about tomorrow's routine at Sterling Tech, but about the conversations she might need to have, the decisions she might need to make, and the carefully maintained silence she might finally need to break. Professor Kim returned to the witness stand the following morning with a stack of technical documents and a laptop computer loaded with analytical software. His testimony from the previous day had established the sophisticated mathematical foundations underlying Sterling Tech's patent portfolio. But Elena's legal team had prepared more pointed questions that would probe deeper into the development timeline and technical feasibility of Richard's claimed innovations. Margaret sat in her usual position, notebook ready. But this time, she found herself leaning forward slightly as Professor Kim began explaining the theoretical complexity of recursive algorithm optimization. He described the mathematical principles involved in achieving significant improvements in data processing efficiency, the years of research typically required to develop such breakthroughs, and the collaborative nature of most advanced computational research. Elena's attorney asked Professor Kim to examine specific patents in Sterling Tech's portfolio, particularly those filed during the company's early years when Richard claimed to have made his most significant breakthroughs. The professor studied the technical documentation carefully, his expression growing increasingly puzzled as he reviewed the mathematical proofs and algorithm designs. Something struck Professor Kim as familiar about the optimization approaches described in the patents. The mathematical methodology, the specific techniques used to solve recursive processing problems, the elegant simplicity of solutions to complex theoretical challenges. He had seen this particular style of problem-solving before, this distinctive approach to mathematical proof and algorithm design. Professor Kim asked permission to examine the technical appendices more closely, particularly the mathematical foundations for a breakthrough algorithm that had been patented in Sterling Tech's second year of operation. As he studied the equations and proof methodology, his expression shifted from puzzlement to recognition, then to something approaching amazement. The professor testified that the mathematical approach demonstrated in these patents was remarkably similar to work he had supervised in his graduate program 15 years earlier. The specific optimization techniques, the unique methodology for solving recursive processing problems, the mathematical notation and proof structure all matched the advanced theoretical work he had guided during a particularly challenging thesis project. Richard's attorney immediately objected, arguing that general mathematical principles could not be considered proprietary to any individual researcher. But Professor Kim clarified that he was not referring to basic mathematical concepts, but rather to a highly specific and innovative approach to a complex theoretical problem that had been developed through months of intensive research under his direct supervision. Margaret felt her heart beginning to race as Professor Kim continued his testimony. He was describing her graduate thesis work, the breakthrough she had achieved after countless hours of struggling with optimization problems that had seemed impossibly complex. She remembered the excitement of finally discovering the mathematical key that unlocked significant improvements in processing efficiency, the satisfaction of proving that her theoretical approach could achieve practical results. Elena's attorney pressed Professor Kim to explain why this particular mathematical approach was significant. The professor responded that the optimization methodology represented a genuine breakthrough in computational theory, the kind of innovation that typically emerged from years of collaborative research involving multiple experts rather than individual effort. The sophistication of the mathematical proof suggested involvement of someone with advanced theoretical training and extensive experience with recursive algorithm design. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Professor Kim's testimony continued. His attorney objected repeatedly, arguing that expert speculation about development methodologies was irrelevant to questions of marital property division. But Judge Hendricks seemed increasingly interested in the technical details, particularly the timeline questions that Professor Kim was raising about the feasibility of rapid innovation in such complex theoretical areas. During cross-examination, Richard's attorney attempted to discredit Professor Kim's analysis by suggesting that mathematical similarities could be coincidental, that advanced researchers might independently develop similar approaches to common problems. But Professor Kim stood firm in his assessment, explaining that the specific combination of techniques and the particular mathematical notation used in the patents was highly distinctive and unlikely to have emerged through independent parallel development. The professor's testimony concluded with a request that surprised both legal teams. He asked permission to examine original development documents, preliminary research notes, and early draft materials that would typically exist for innovations of this complexity. Such documentation, he testified, would provide clear evidence of the actual development process and timeline for the mathematical breakthroughs in question. Richard's attorney argued vigorously against allowing such examination, claiming that preliminary research materials were proprietary company information protected by trade secret laws. But Elena's legal team countered that understanding the true development process was essential for proper asset valuation, and Judge Hendricks agreed to consider the request. During a brief recess, Margaret noticed increased activity among the legal teams as both sides huddled in urgent consultations. She overheard fragments of worried conversations about document production requirements, about the potential implications of technical scrutiny, about strategies for protecting Richard's version of events from deeper investigation. Margaret stepped outside for fresh air and found herself standing next to Sarah Martinez, the court reporter, who was taking a brief break from her transcription duties. Sarah mentioned that she had covered many technology cases over the years, but had never seen expert testimony that raised such specific questions about development methodology and timeline feasibility. Sarah had also noticed Margaret's reactions during Professor Kim's testimony, the way she seemed to recognize the mathematical concepts he was describing, the subtle nods of understanding when he explained complex theoretical principles. Sarah wondered aloud whether Margaret's engineering background might give her insights into the technical questions that were emerging during the proceedings. When testimony resumed, Judge Hendricks announced her decision regarding document examination. She was appointing Dr. Michael Wong, a computational expert from UC Berkeley, to serve as a court-appointed technical advisor who would review original development materials and provide independent analysis of the innovation timeline and methodology questions raised by Professor Kim's testimony. Richard's face went pale as the judge explained that both parties would be required to produce all original research notes, preliminary drafts, email communications, and supporting documentation related to the patents in question. Dr. Wong would examine these materials to determine whether the claimed development timeline was technically feasible and whether the mathematical sophistication evident in the final patents was consistent with the available research resources and expertise. Elena's attorney immediately requested that the examination include any personal research files that employees might have maintained independently, arguing that a complete technical review required access to all documentation related to the development process. Richard's legal team objected strenuously, but Judge Hendricks ruled that the scope of document production would be determined after preliminary review by the court-appointed expert. As the implications of the judge's ruling became clear, Margaret watched Richard's confident demeanor begin to crack for the first time. His attorney called for a brief consultation, and Margaret could see urgent whispered conversations about document retention policies, about employee access to proprietary materials, about potential complications that might arise from comprehensive technical review. During the consultation break, Margaret found herself thinking about the file cabinets in her apartment, about 15 years of careful documentation that she had maintained through habit and professional caution. She had copies of everything: initial problem statements, mathematical proofs, algorithm designs, test results, email exchanges documenting every stage of the development process for every major innovation that had built Sterling Tech's success. Professor Kim approached Margaret during the break, recognizing her from his graduate program 15 years earlier. He remembered her as one of his most brilliant students, someone whose theoretical insights had impressed even his faculty colleagues. He mentioned that the mathematical methodology he had described in his testimony was remarkably similar to the breakthrough work she had accomplished in her graduate thesis research. Margaret felt a moment of vertigo as the conversation continued. Professor Kim was describing her own work, recognizing her mathematical signature in patents that had been attributed entirely to Richard Sterling for 15 years. She realized that her former mentor was unknowingly providing expert validation for innovations she had actually created, breakthroughs that had emerged from her theoretical research and mathematical insights. As the session prepared to resume, Margaret noticed that Richard was staring at her with an expression she had never seen before. For 15 years, his gaze had been dismissive, distant, treating her as invisible furniture in his professional environment. But now there was something different in his eyes, something that looked almost like recognition, or perhaps the beginning of concern. The afternoon testimony introduced more technical complexities as Dr. Wong outlined his methodology for examining development documentation. He explained that advanced mathematical innovations typically left clear forensic trails, handwritten calculations, preliminary proofs, iterative refinements, collaborative exchanges that documented the evolution of theoretical insights into practical applications. Margaret sat quietly through the technical discussions, but internally, she was calculating the implications of comprehensive document review. She knew that her personal files contained overwhelming evidence of her actual role in Sterling Tech's innovations, mathematical proofs in her handwriting, algorithm designs bearing her initials, email chains where she had explained complex concepts to Richard in terms he could understand and present to investors. As Margaret gathered her notes at the end of the day, she realized that tomorrow would bring decisions she had been avoiding for 15 years. The protective silence that had defined her professional survival was about to be challenged by forces beyond her control. The question was whether she would continue to hide behind professional invisibility, or whether the time had finally come to reclaim the innovations that had built an empire from her mathematical insights and theoretical breakthroughs. Walking toward her car through the courthouse parking garage, Margaret felt the weight of 15 years of documentation waiting in her apartment, evidence that could transform not just a divorce proceeding, but the entire foundation of Richard Sterling's professional reputation and personal fortune. Dr. Michael Wong arrived at the courthouse 3 days later carrying 2 oversized briefcases and a laptop computer loaded with forensic analysis software. His preliminary review of Sterling Tech's patent documentation had raised enough questions to warrant a comprehensive audit of all supporting materials, original research notes, and development records spanning the company's 15-year history. Margaret sat in the gallery watching as boxes of documents were wheeled into the courtroom on metal carts. Richard's legal team had produced what they claimed was complete documentation, patent applications, filing correspondence, business records, and selected email communications. But Dr. Wong's initial examination had already identified significant gaps in the timeline that would require additional materials to resolve. Judge Hendricks reviewed Dr. Wong's preliminary findings with obvious interest. His report indicated that several major patents showed evidence of sophisticated mathematical development that would typically require extensive preliminary research, yet the supporting documentation provided by Sterling Tech contained no evidence of such preparatory work. The final patent applications appeared almost fully formed, lacking the iterative drafts and progressive refinements that characterize genuine innovation processes. Dr. Wong testified that authentic technological breakthroughs typically generated substantial forensic evidence, handwritten calculations, experimental data, collaborative exchanges, preliminary proofs, failed attempts, and gradual refinements over extended periods. The Sterling Tech patents showed none of this developmental complexity, suggesting either that critical documentation had not been preserved or that the innovation process had occurred elsewhere and been transferred into the formal patent applications. Elena's attorney immediately requested expanded document production to include all employee files, personal research materials, and any independent documentation that might exist outside Sterling Tech's official records. Richard's legal team objected vehemently, arguing that employee personal files were beyond the scope of marital property proceedings and potentially violated privacy rights. But Judge Hendricks was clearly troubled by the technical inconsistencies Dr. Wong had identified. She ruled that any employee who had been involved in research and development activities could be required to produce relevant documentation, particularly if such materials might clarify the actual innovation timeline and methodology that had created Sterling Tech's valuable patent portfolio. Margaret felt her heart racing as the judge's ruling sank in. Richard turned to stare at her with an expression she had never seen before, his confident facade replaced by something approaching panic. For 15 years, he had dismissed her as harmless administrative support, but now she represented a potential threat to the foundation of his professional reputation and personal fortune. Margaret was formally served with a subpoena requiring her to produce any personal files related to Sterling Tech's research and development activities. She had 48 hours to compile and deliver all relevant documentation for expert examination. Richard's attorney attempted to argue that a secretary could not possibly possess materials relevant to complex technical innovations, but Dr. Wong intervened to explain that comprehensive forensic analysis required examining all potential sources of developmental evidence. Margaret returned to her apartment that evening with a new sense of purpose and anticipation. She opened the file cabinets she had maintained for 15 years, pulling out folders containing mathematical proofs, algorithm designs, handwritten calculations, and detailed research notes that documented every breakthrough that had built Sterling Tech's success. The documentation was comprehensive and meticulously organized. Margaret had copies of initial problem statements, theoretical approaches, mathematical proofs, algorithm designs, test results, performance analyses, and detailed explanations she had prepared to help Richard understand the technical concepts he would need to present to investors and patent attorneys. Most significantly, Margaret discovered that many of the original patent applications contained her signature in a section she had forgotten about. As the technical consultant who had prepared the supporting documentation, she had been required to sign affidavits confirming the accuracy and completeness of the mathematical proofs and algorithm descriptions included in the patent submissions. Margaret spent the night organizing her files into chronological order, creating a comprehensive timeline that showed her actual role in developing every major innovation that had made Sterling Tech successful. The evidence was overwhelming. 15 years of handwritten calculations in her distinctive style, algorithm designs bearing her initials, mathematical proofs using notation systems she had developed during her graduate research. 2 days later, Margaret arrived at the courthouse carrying 3 boxes of documentation. Richard watched with obvious anxiety as she delivered her materials to Dr. Wong for examination. His attorney immediately questioned the authenticity of documents that had been maintained outside official company records, suggesting that personal files could have been altered or fabricated to support false claims. Dr. Wong began his analysis by comparing handwriting samples from Margaret's files with known authentic documents from her employment records. The analysis confirmed that the mathematical calculations and algorithm designs had been created by the same person who had signed routine administrative documents throughout her 15-year tenure at Sterling Tech. More damaging to Richard's position was the discovery that Margaret's files contained original research notes that predated the official patent applications by several months. Her handwritten calculations showed the progressive development of mathematical solutions, the iterative refinements and breakthrough moments that were completely absent from Sterling Tech's official records. Dr. Wong's testimony revealed that Margaret's personal files contained exactly the type of developmental documentation that should have existed in Sterling Tech's records, but had been mysteriously absent. Her notes showed the mathematical foundation work, the theoretical challenges, the experimental approaches, and the gradual optimization that authentic innovation required. Richard's attorney desperately attempted to discredit Margaret's documentation, suggesting that she had forged materials or reconstructed historical records to support false claims. But forensic analysis of the paper, ink, and writing implements proved that the documents had been created over the time frame indicated, with no evidence of recent alteration or fabrication. Dr. Wong's most devastating finding emerged from computer forensic analysis of Sterling Tech's server records. Electronic timestamps showed that Margaret had been accessing the company's research databases during extensive late-night sessions, often working until 3 or 4 in the morning on complex algorithm development projects. These sessions consistently preceded Richard's breakthrough announcements by several days or weeks. The server records also revealed that Margaret's computer account had been used to create the original draft versions of technical documentation that formed the basis for patent applications. Richard's account showed only brief review sessions and minor editorial changes to materials that had been fundamentally created through Margaret's late-night research work. Professor Kim was recalled to examine Margaret's personal research files, and his testimony provided expert validation for what the documentation revealed. He confirmed that the mathematical methodology, the theoretical approaches, and the specific notation systems evident in Margaret's notes were consistent with the advanced graduate work she had completed under his supervision 15 years earlier. More importantly, Professor Kim testified that the handwritten calculations in Margaret's files demonstrated genuine mathematical insight and innovative problem-solving that could not have been copied or reconstructed after the fact. The progressive development of solutions, the false starts and corrections, the breakthrough moments documented in her notes all indicated authentic research work performed over extended periods. During cross-examination, Richard's attorney pressed Professor Kim about whether Margaret could have simply documented work that Richard had actually performed. But the professor explained that mathematical research left distinctive forensic signatures, that the thought processes and methodological approaches evident in Margaret's notes could only have been created by someone with advanced theoretical training actively engaged in solving complex problems. As Dr. Wong's analysis continued, former Sterling Tech employees began to come forward with memories that contradicted Richard's version of events. Several engineers testified that they remembered Margaret's technical contributions during the company's early years, her ability to solve problems that had stumped other team members, her detailed explanations of mathematical concepts that had guided their development work. One particularly damaging testimony came from David Rodriguez, a former senior engineer who had left Sterling Tech 5 years earlier. He testified that Margaret had regularly provided technical guidance and mathematical support for projects that were officially attributed to Richard's leadership. Rodriguez specifically remembered a critical breakthrough in optimization algorithms, where Margaret had worked through the mathematical proof while Richard observed and asked clarifying questions. Richard's confident demeanor was completely shattered as the scope of Margaret's documentation became clear. His attorney called for multiple recesses as they struggled to develop responses to evidence that systematically dismantled 15 years of carefully constructed mythology about his individual genius and innovation. Margaret sat quietly through the testimony, watching as her actual contributions were finally being recognized after 15 years of professional invisibility. The truth was emerging through expert analysis and forensic evidence that could not be dismissed or discredited through legal maneuvering. As the day concluded, Judge Hendricks announced that she would be expanding the investigation to include additional forensic analysis of Margaret's files and comprehensive review of Sterling Tech's historical records. Richard Sterling's empire of claimed innovation was crumbling under scrutiny that revealed the true source of the mathematical insights and technological breakthroughs that had built his fortune. The courthouse was packed beyond normal capacity as word had spread through Silicon Valley's legal community about the extraordinary revelations emerging from the Sterling divorce proceedings. Margaret arrived carrying a laptop computer and a presentation remote, having been called to testify about the comprehensive documentation that had shattered Richard's claims of individual innovation. Elena's attorney began by asking Margaret to explain her educational background and her actual role at Sterling Tech during the company's 15-year history. For the first time in a legal proceeding, Margaret was invited to speak about her engineering expertise, her graduate research experience, and her systematic involvement in every major technological breakthrough that had built the company's patent portfolio. Margaret's voice was calm and clear as she described her master's degree in electrical engineering from Stanford, her specialized training in computational optimization theory, and her thesis research on recursive algorithm design under Professor Kim's supervision. She explained that her original intention had been to pursue a career in research and development, but economic circumstances had led her to accept administrative support position with the promise of eventual advancement to technical roles. The advancement had never materialized, Margaret testified, but her passion for mathematical problem-solving had continued throughout her tenure at Sterling Tech. She had consistently volunteered to provide technical support for complex projects, working extended hours to solve theoretical challenges that enabled the company's technological innovations. Margaret's testimony then shifted to her comprehensive documentation system. She explained that her engineering training had instilled habits of meticulous record-keeping, maintaining detailed files of all research work, mathematical calculations, and problem-solving processes. Over 15 years, these files had grown into a complete archive of Sterling Tech's actual innovation development. Dr. Wong was called to present his forensic analysis of Margaret's documentation alongside Sterling Tech's official records. His findings were devastating to Richard's position. The expert testimony revealed that Margaret's personal files contained original mathematical proofs, algorithm designs, and theoretical breakthroughs that had later appeared in patent applications attributed entirely to Richard Sterling. The forensic analysis went beyond simple document comparison. Dr. Wong had traced the evolution of complex mathematical concepts through Margaret's handwritten notes, showing progressive development of solutions over weeks and months of intensive research. Her files documented false starts, breakthrough moments, iterative refinements, and final optimizations that represented genuine intellectual work rather than copied or reconstructed materials. Judge Hendricks asked Margaret to explain specific innovations that had generated Sterling Tech's most valuable patents. Margaret's response was technically sophisticated and detailed, demonstrating comprehensive understanding of mathematical principles and optimization theory that extended far beyond administrative knowledge. She described the theoretical challenges involved in recursive algorithm improvement, the innovative approaches she had developed to achieve significant processing efficiency gains, and the mathematical methodology that had enabled breakthrough solutions. Richard's attorney attempted to discredit Margaret's testimony by suggesting that her technical knowledge had been acquired through years of exposure to Richard's explanations rather than original research capability. The attorney's challenge backfired spectacularly when Judge Hendricks invited Margaret to demonstrate her mathematical expertise through live problem-solving. Margaret was provided with a whiteboard and asked to explain the optimization methodology underlying Sterling Tech's most valuable patent, the algorithm that generated $12 million annually in licensing revenue. Her explanation was methodical, confident, and technically precise. She worked through complex mathematical equations, demonstrated optimization principles, and provided theoretical justification for algorithmic approaches with the fluency of genuine expertise. The courtroom fell silent as Margaret completed her mathematical demonstration. Her explanation revealed not just technical knowledge, but innovative insight and creative problem-solving ability that could not have been acquired through passive observation. The mathematical proof she presented was elegant, sophisticated, and entirely consistent with the methodology documented in her personal research files. Richard was then invited to provide his own explanation of the same optimization methodology. The contrast was immediate and devastating. Richard's attempt at mathematical explanation was superficial, confused, and technically incorrect. He could not work through the equations Margaret had presented, could not explain the theoretical foundations of his claimed innovation, and became increasingly flustered as his lack of genuine understanding became obvious to everyone present. Judge Hendricks pressed Richard to explain specific aspects of the mathematical proof that Margaret had demonstrated. His responses revealed fundamental gaps in understanding that made his claims of original innovation completely untenable. Richard could not explain why certain optimization approaches worked, could not justify mathematical decisions that were critical to algorithm efficiency, and could not demonstrate the theoretical insight that would be required for genuine breakthrough innovation. Margaret was asked to address the specific patents in Sterling Tech's portfolio, explaining her role in developing each major innovation. Her testimony was comprehensive and detailed, supported by handwritten calculations, algorithm designs, and mathematical proofs that she had maintained in her personal files. She described the theoretical challenges that had required months of intensive research, the breakthrough moments when solutions had finally emerged, and the optimization processes that had transformed abstract mathematical concepts into practical applications. The scope of Margaret's actual contributions became clear as her testimony continued. She had been responsible for developing the mathematical foundations underlying 47 separate patents, innovations that had generated hundreds of millions of dollars in licensing revenue and enabled Sterling Tech's expansion into international markets. Computer forensic expert Jennifer Park was called to present analysis of Sterling Tech's electronic records that provided additional confirmation of Margaret's testimony. Server logs showed that Margaret's computer account had been used to create original draft versions of technical documentation for every major patent application, typically during extended late-night sessions when the building was otherwise empty. The electronic evidence revealed a consistent pattern over 15 years. Margaret would work through complex mathematical problems during solitary research sessions, develop innovative solutions through intensive calculation and analysis, then prepare detailed technical explanations that Richard would review and present as his own work to investors, attorneys, and patent examiners. Email records recovered from backup systems provided even more damaging evidence against Richard's claims. The communications showed Margaret explaining complex mathematical concepts to Richard in simplified terms, providing step-by-step guidance for understanding theoretical principles, and answering his detailed questions about optimization methodology and algorithm design. One particularly revealing email exchange showed Margaret patiently explaining the mathematical foundations of recursive algorithm optimization to Richard over 17 separate messages, providing increasingly detailed explanations as he struggled to understand concepts that she had developed through her original research. Richard's attorney made a desperate final attempt to salvage his client's position by suggesting that Margaret's documentation could have been created retroactively to support false claims. But Dr. Wong's forensic analysis had already demolished this possibility through comprehensive examination of paper composition, ink chemistry, and writing implement analysis that proved the documents had been created over the time frames indicated. Professor Kim was recalled for final expert testimony that provided definitive validation of Margaret's innovative contributions. He testified that the mathematical methodology evident in her personal files represented genuine breakthrough research that advanced the theoretical foundations of computational optimization. Her work demonstrated the kind of original thinking and creative insight that characterized authentic innovation rather than copied or reconstructed materials. The professor's most powerful testimony addressed the question of whether Margaret's innovations could have been developed collaboratively with Richard's guidance. Professor Kim explained that the mathematical sophistication evident in Margaret's work required advanced theoretical training and independent research capability that could not be acquired through instruction or collaboration with someone who lacked comparable expertise. Margaret's transformation during the proceedings was remarkable to observe. The quiet, invisible secretary who had spent 15 years taking notes in the corner of boardrooms had emerged as a confident, articulate engineer whose technical expertise commanded respect from experts, attorneys, and judicial officials. As the testimony concluded, Judge Hendricks addressed Richard directly, asking whether he wished to provide additional explanation for the mathematical inconsistencies and documentation gaps that had been revealed through comprehensive forensic analysis. Richard's response was incoherent, defensive, and completely inadequate to address the overwhelming evidence that had systematically dismantled his claims of individual innovation. Margaret gathered her materials and returned to her seat in the gallery, but the atmosphere in the courtroom had fundamentally changed. She was no longer invisible, no longer dismissed as administrative support. The truth about Sterling Tech's innovations had finally been revealed, and Margaret Chun was recognized as the brilliant engineer whose mathematical insights had built a technology empire that someone else had claimed as his own achievement for 15 years. Judge Hendricks returned to the bench after a 2-hour recess, carrying a thick folder containing her analysis of the extraordinary evidence that had emerged during the proceedings. The packed courtroom fell silent as she prepared to deliver a ruling that would fundamentally reshape the Sterling family's financial future and determine the rightful ownership of innovations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The judge's voice was measured and authoritative as she began by summarizing the technical evidence that had been presented over the previous weeks. Dr. Wong's forensic analysis had established beyond reasonable doubt that Margaret Chin possessed comprehensive documentation proving her role as the actual inventor of Sterling Tech's entire patent portfolio, innovations that had been systematically attributed to Richard Sterling for 15 years. Judge Hendricks explained that the evidence revealed a pattern of intellectual property theft that extended far beyond typical marital asset disputes. Margaret's personal files contained mathematical proofs, algorithm designs, and theoretical breakthroughs that had generated the foundational technology for a multinational corporation, yet she had received no recognition, no compensation, and no acknowledgement of her innovative contributions. The judge's ruling was comprehensive and devastating to Richard's position. She declared that Margaret Chun was the rightful inventor of all 47 patents in Sterling Tech's portfolio, innovations that had been developed through her mathematical research and theoretical insights over the company's 15-year history. The patents would be transferred immediately from Richard Sterling's name to Margaret Chen's ownership, along with all associated licensing rights and revenue streams. Judge Hendricks then addressed the question of financial damages, explaining that Margaret was entitled to compensation for 15 years of stolen royalties, licensing fees, and company profits that had been generated through her innovations. The court-appointed financial expert had calculated total damages at $437 million, representing the full value of intellectual property that had been improperly attributed to Richard Sterling. Richard's face went ashen as the financial implications became clear. His personal assets, including the 7-bedroom mansion in Los Altos Hills, the luxury vehicle collection, and all investment portfolios, would be frozen immediately pending completion of damage payments to Margaret. Sterling Tech's corporate structure would be reorganized to reflect Margaret's majority ownership position based on her intellectual property contributions. The judge continued by explaining that Margaret's ownership stake in Sterling Tech would be calculated based on the value of her innovative contributions relative to other corporate assets. Since the patent portfolio represented approximately 85% of the company's total value, Margaret would receive majority control of Sterling Tech with immediate authority over corporate operations and strategic decisions. Elena Sterling's divorce settlement would be recalculated based on the corrected asset valuations, which showed that Richard's actual financial position was far lower than originally claimed. Without the intellectual property that had been stolen from Margaret, Richard's legitimate marital assets were limited to his MBA credentials and accumulated salary from his corporate management role. Margaret sat quietly as the judge's ruling unfolded, but tears were flowing down her face as she finally received recognition for 15 years of brilliant mathematical work that had been systematically erased from corporate history. The invisible secretary who had spent her career taking notes in the corner of boardrooms was being acknowledged as the engineering genius whose innovations had built a technology empire. Judge Hendricks addressed Margaret directly, expressing the court's recognition of the injustice she had suffered and the extraordinary contribution she had made to advancing computational technology. The judge noted that Margaret's case represented one of the most extensive patterns of intellectual property theft that had ever been documented in Silicon Valley legal proceedings. Richard's attorney made a final desperate attempt to challenge the ruling, arguing that the transfer of patent ownership would destroy Sterling Tech's corporate value and eliminate jobs for hundreds of employees. But Judge Hendricks rejected these arguments, explaining that intellectual property belonged to its rightful creator regardless of economic convenience or corporate disruption. The judge's ruling included immediate implementation orders that would take effect within 72 hours. Richard would be removed from all corporate leadership positions at Sterling Tech, replaced by Margaret as Chief Executive Officer with full authority over company operations. All patent licensing agreements would be renegotiated to reflect Margaret's ownership, with revised revenue streams flowing directly to her accounts rather than Richard's personal holdings. Richard made one final attempt to address the court, his voice shaking as he tried to justify 15 years of systematic credit theft. He claimed that Margaret had been adequately compensated through her salary and benefits, that her work had been performed during company time using corporate resources, and that his management and presentation skills had been essential for transforming her theoretical insights into commercial success. Judge Hendricks cut him off sharply, explaining that innovation belonged to its creator regardless of employment arrangements or corporate structure. Mathematical breakthroughs and algorithm designs could not be transferred through management oversight or presentation skills, and Richard's lack of genuine technical understanding had been definitively established through his failed attempts to explain his claimed innovations. Margaret was invited to address the court regarding her experience and the significance of the ruling. Her response was measured, thoughtful, and gracious despite the magnitude of injustice she had suffered. She spoke about the importance of intellectual honesty in technological development, the need to recognize and credit genuine innovation regardless of gender or corporate hierarchy, and her commitment to ensuring that Sterling Tech's future would be built on principles of fairness and authentic recognition of employee contributions. Margaret explained that she intended to use her restored position to create opportunities for other undervalued engineers and researchers whose contributions might be overlooked by traditional corporate structures. She would establish mentorship programs, research fellowships, and innovation recognition systems designed to prevent the systematic erasure of intellectual contributions that had defined her own career experience. The proceedings concluded with Judge Hendricks ordering immediate asset transfers and corporate restructuring to implement her ruling. Richard would retain legal representation to appeal the decision, but the judge noted that the overwhelming forensic evidence made successful appeal extremely unlikely given the comprehensive documentation of intellectual property theft. Margaret left the courthouse that day as the majority owner of Sterling Tech Industries, a company valued at over $300 million built on innovations she had created during 15 years of invisible mathematical genius. The transformation was surreal. The secretary who had struggled to afford rent on her modest apartment was now one of Silicon Valley's wealthiest technology executives. 6 months later, Margaret Chin stood in the same boardroom where she had once sat silently taking notes while Richard Sterling claimed credit for her innovations. But now she occupied Richard's former position at the head of the table, addressing investors and corporate partners as the recognized genius behind Sterling Tech's technological breakthroughs. The company had thrived under Margaret's leadership, with her authentic technical expertise enabling new innovations and strategic partnerships that had been impossible during Richard's management tenure. Major technology companies were eager to collaborate with the engineer whose mathematical insights had already revolutionized computational efficiency, and Margaret's vision for future development attracted investment capital that had previously been skeptical of Sterling Tech's prospects. Richard Sterling had found employment as an administrative assistant at a small consulting firm in San Jose, earning $42,000 annually while struggling to make court-ordered restitution payments to Margaret. His fall from Silicon Valley prominence had been swift and complete, as the engineering community learned about the massive intellectual property fraud that had built his former reputation. The irony was not lost on Margaret that Richard now experienced the professional invisibility and systematic dismissal that had defined her own career for 15 years. He handled filing, scheduling, and basic correspondence while more qualified colleagues received credit and recognition for substantive work. The luxury mansion, expensive cars, and elite social status had been replaced by a studio apartment and public transportation as he attempted to rebuild his life after losing everything to the mathematical genius he had exploited for so long. Margaret's story had inspired other undervalued employees throughout Silicon Valley to document their contributions more carefully and assert their intellectual property rights when appropriate. Engineering organizations established new guidelines for recognizing collaborative innovation, and several major companies implemented stronger protections for employee intellectual contributions following the extensive publicity surrounding the Sterling case. Professor Kim had returned to Stanford with renewed commitment to mentoring brilliant students like Margaret, ensuring that their innovations would be properly credited and their careers supported regardless of gender or corporate politics. He frequently used Margaret's case as an example in his graduate seminars, demonstrating how mathematical genius could be systematically overlooked and exploited by less capable individuals in positions of corporate authority. Margaret established the Chun Foundation for Innovation Recognition, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting undervalued researchers and ensuring that intellectual contributions were properly attributed regardless of corporate hierarchy or social dynamics. The foundation provided legal resources, documentation training, and advocacy support for engineers and scientists whose work might otherwise be claimed by colleagues or supervisors. The Foundation's first major initiative was a comprehensive study of intellectual property attribution in technology companies, examining patterns of credit and recognition to identify systematic biases that prevented qualified individuals from receiving appropriate acknowledgement for their contributions. Margaret's personal experience had revealed that her case was not unique, but rather representative of broader problems in how innovative work was recognized and rewarded throughout Silicon Valley. Margaret's transformation from invisible secretary to celebrated technology executive had become legendary in engineering circles, proof that mathematical brilliance and innovative insight could eventually triumph over corporate politics and systematic exploitation. Her story demonstrated that documentation, persistence, and commitment to intellectual honesty could overcome even the most entrenched patterns of professional invisibility. As Margaret stood in her corner office overlooking Silicon Valley, she reflected on the 15 years of brilliant work that had finally received proper recognition and the mathematical insights that had built not just a corporate empire, but a foundation for ensuring that future innovations would be credited to their rightful creators. The invisible genius had become visible at last, and her legacy would extend far beyond the algorithms that had made her wealthy to the systemic changes that would protect other brilliant minds from experiencing the exploitation that had defined her own remarkable journey. This story raises important questions about recognition, credit, and the invisible contributions that often drive major innovations. Have you ever experienced a situation where your ideas or work weren't properly recognized, or witnessed someone else taking credit for contributions they didn't make? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below, because stories like Margaret's remind us that brilliance often exists in the most unexpected places, waiting for the right moment to finally be acknowledged and celebrated.